The idea of free riding within NATO was once a fringe concept. If you tried talking about it with someone from outside of the national security sphere, it probably would have drawn confused stares. Now, though, the free riding accusation is so commonplace that there is a good chance that the person would have an opinion on the subject. And if they do not currently, just wait until the NATO summit at The Hague, scheduled in just over a week, which will gather all of the member countries' heads of state. The big topic on the agenda will be raising target defense spending to 5% of GDP, which itself was the topic of my most recent video over on the main channel. However, the free riding narrative has been so pervasive that it has suppressed conversations about other critical parts of NATO defense calculations. Indeed, what if there were a counter-incentive, which actually made a country more inclined to spend money on materiel when it knows that a fellow country was also going to spend a ton of money? Well, there is. It is called strategic complementarity, which is not easy to say, but is a critical part of how NATO operates. To learn more about these strategic complementarities, I spoke to Andrés Gannon, an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, who studies alliance arms portfolios and has previously spent time at the NATO Defense College. I began by asking him about the central problem with alliances and defense spending. Why don't we start off by talking about some of the baseline hurdles that alliances have in getting spending to be done at the level that the alliance would collectively want it to be at?
The basic problem alliances face is a collective action problem. You have multiple actors who are trying to work together towards a common goal. The problem is if any one of them opts out of contributing towards that goal, they can still reap the benefits. Meaning, if your allies spend money on their security and you don't, you're still more secure. So that creates a problem where each individual member has an incentive not to make contributions, which, if that exists for all of them, means that overall they don't end up having the security that they need.
Can you go into a little bit more depth about the exact problem that NATO has with that, or at least is perceived to have with that?
The problem that we're seeing with NATO is an accusation that non-US members are not paying enough towards NATO's collective security, but they're still being made more secure because of the efforts of others. And we saw these accusations during the first Trump administration, but that's far from the first time. President Obama made the same complaints about NATO, even going back to President John F. Kennedy. There was accusations that the United States is shouldering most of the burden and that US allies in NATO were getting more secure as a result without making contributions towards that security themselves.
Now, obviously, that's true to some degree if we look at the baseline data on military spending within NATO over a long period of time, where the United States has long been a high spender and most European countries have been relatively low spending. Although, if you look even more recently, some of the countries in Eastern Europe are high spenders, and in this case right now, Poland exceeds everyone else in the alliance, including the United States. But the reason that I wanted to talk to you today is that if we push aside the spending differences, there is some sort of interesting interplay between the United States and NATO partner countries, as well as non-United States pairs of NATO partner countries, and how they're choosing how to spend their money on the military. And that might give some hope as we head into the upcoming NATO Heads of State Summit at The Hague and the incoming raise in the threshold spending for NATO countries to 5%. And I'm going to let you say the magic word because I have an awful time trying to pronounce this.
That's right. The magic word is strategic complementarities, which is that what I produce for my military and what you produce for your military should not be seen as the same thing, but should be seen as capabilities that complement one another because they are different. So while it's really tempting to look at top-line spending figures, either as a percent of GDP or overall amount of military spending, what countries are spending their defense dollars on is actually more important. And so if countries are able to have a complementarity where I build tanks and you build vehicles that those tanks can be transported on, that's better than both of us just trying to build both of those capabilities simultaneously.
Let me make sure I'm getting this correct. This is not just a story about specialization, where I focus on constructing one thing and being really good at constructing that one thing. It is that you and I, when we come together, are able to make more out of the sum of the parts, holding fixed the number of parts that we have, than would be the alternative if each of us were trying to build a military on our own.
That's right. We've known from political economy going back to Adam Smith that there's specialization benefits of focusing on a smaller set of tasks. Within a factory, that's why you have an assembly line where each person does something individually that together makes the larger part in ways that give you economies of scale. What we're missing from just having that story is that specialization also depends on what everybody else is producing. So the complementarity you get are benefits from a division of labor where, given some fixed set of resources that each actor is spending on defense, I do one thing, you do another thing, and by spending the same amount of resources as we would have ourselves, we end up having more overall.
Well, this is sounding like a win-win, which is rare when it comes to conversations about NATO alliance spending. Can you talk about some specific examples that we've seen so far with the NATO alliance before we get much deeper into this conversation, perhaps about what might happen in the future when there is the bump in NATO defense spending?
There's lots of military capabilities that the United States has not had to invest as heavily in because its allies in NATO or otherwise have. So the United States only has, up until recently, 3 operational icebreakers because NATO allies in the Arctic have over 40. So the US is able to get access to the region through those. This also happened during the Iran-Iraq tanker war when the United States lacked access to minesweepers that were able to clear mines that had been laid in the Gulf by Iran. But once again, the European allies provided minesweepers while the United States provided larger naval vessels. We've also seen this in cooperation between the United States and Japan, for example, where Japan has a lot of the capabilities that can protect sea lines of communication that are further away from the coast. And we even see this going as far back as the invasion of Normandy during World War II, where the United Kingdom provided the amphibious assault vehicles that transported tanks from the large naval vessels out in the ocean onto land, and the United States provided those large naval vessels as well as many of the troops that did the ground invasion themselves.
And I think in an earlier conversation, you had mentioned something about Estonia and cybersecurity.
Yeah, depending on who you ask, Estonia is the first, second, or third most powerful cyber military in the world, which seems really surprising given their small size, given the rest of their military is not particularly large or impressive, but this was a conscious decision that NATO did after Estonia faced cyber attacks by Russia years ago to have Estonia provide many of the cyber capabilities for the rest of the NATO alliance. So the United States certainly still does a lot of cyber capabilities itself, but this is a capability that Estonia is able to provide to the rest of the alliance without Estonia having to provide a lot of tanks or aircraft instead.
Something you said actually triggered where I wanted to go with the next part of this conversation, which is that you had mentioned that this was a conscious decision by NATO to have Estonia focus on cybersecurity. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the previous examples and then the general organization of this, because it's one thing for NATO to just magically and luckily happen to have these sorts of strategic complementarities. It's another thing for them to strategically plan to have these ahead of time. So where exactly is that happening, and how much of this is just pure happenstance versus a plan all along from the alliance?
Very little of it is by happenstance. What we tend to see is NATO as an institution or as an alliance deciding what are the capabilities that we need collectively and what are the most efficient ways to allocate the distribution or the responsibility for those capabilities across members in the alliance. So after Russia attacked Estonia with a large series of cyber attacks around 2008, NATO decided to establish a cyber center for excellence within Estonia that Estonia would lead, and Estonia was then providing the cyber capabilities that would be shared both informationally and in terms of computational capabilities with the rest of the alliance. This is also something that we saw happen in the Minesweepers example during the Iran-Iraq tanker war, where there was a conscious decision by US naval admirals who thought the best thing would be to have, quote, 1,000 gray holes flying together. That was a decision of the United States shouldn't provide every naval vessel. Let's figure out things that are within the industrial capacity of other countries and have them produce those things for the rest of the alliance. If Estonia had only cyber capabilities, that wouldn't put them in a great place defense-wise. Having strong cybersecurity and cyber defense, even offensive cyber capabilities, won't do a lot to stop an invasion. But what NATO realized they were able to do is having Estonia focus on cyber capabilities freed up their resources by having them not focus on things like air defense or things that would stop a ground invasion, with the understanding that NATO would provide those capabilities for them. And so this is something that allows other states in NATO to not have to focus on creating a dedicated cyber command, an entire new branch of the military, because they get that sort of information and training from Estonia in exchange for making sure that if Estonia was to get invaded, they would provide the material capabilities to repel that invasion.
Along those lines, in our conversation before recording, I think you had mentioned a weird example involving Albania.
Actually, with Albania, what we saw in the early 2000s was Albania acquired a couple dozen of a coastal patrol vessel that had a range of about 2,000 nautical miles, which means that Albania, who has a coastline about the length of New Jersey, had the capability to go out as far as Portugal, which seems really bizarre. What business would Albania have patrolling parts of the coast that are outside of the Mediterranean Sea? And the answer was that this was happening while Albania was trying to get NATO membership, where what they were doing was signaling an ability to make a contribution to the alliance by doing coastal patrol in the Mediterranean that would deal with things like terrorism, drug trafficking, migration interdiction, to show that we can contribute this capability to NATO, so that NATO allies in the Mediterranean don't have to focus on this as much, and we, in exchange, won't have to focus on as much on having a strong and capable air force.
Wait, let me make sure I'm getting the timing of this right. Albania started constructing these coastal patrol vessels even before Albania had entered into NATO, which would mean that at some level, NATO was probably thinking to itself, Albania, if it joined NATO, would be contributing this to the alliance, and that we need this. So that might make it more attractive for us to have Albania into the alliance. But then going on the other side of the equation, that also means perhaps that Albania was thinking to itself, how do we make ourselves more attractive to the alliance so that we get our membership into the alliance? One way that we do it is this. Am I getting this right here?
That's exactly right. The common misperception is that small states can't bring a lot to the table when it comes to security. What we see in this Albania example was an explicit and intentional understanding of the opposite. The United States, for example, sent a bunch of its navy to Albania and said, we will help train you in coastal patrol if you develop the capabilities that would allow you to do this towards NATO. And in showing that you can bring something to NATO in terms of making a contribution to security, that's a way of demonstrating you're not just going to be a drag or a liability when it comes to contributing to NATO's overall defense. You're actually being a contributor.
I suspect a lot of people listening to this are having alarm bells going off in their head, which is that there's a parallel right now in the world, which is Ukraine and drones. How do you think that's going to play out in the future?
Yeah, in the discussions about Ukraine joining NATO, what we tend to see people talking about now is, sure, this is good for Ukraine, but what does NATO get out of it? And I think one of the things that Ukraine is trying to demonstrate is what we can bring to the table is a strong operational capacity in developing and producing drones, and also a lot of institutional knowledge about how to use these on the battlefield. And I think that given how recent drone warfare is and how few countries lack significant experience in using these in interstate conflict, that Ukraine, irrespective of whether they're able to join NATO in the future, are able to make a convincing case that we are a useful ally to have.
Well, I think this is a good place to pivot to the main topic of conversation for the day for NATO, which is 5%. That's the big number that's being floated around inside of the halls of Brussels at the moment, and will be a more serious topic of conversation at the upcoming Heads of State Summit in The Hague in the next week or so. At the same time, that number is shocking because 5% is much larger than the current 2% target that was set at the Wales Summit back in 2014, and there are still a bunch of countries that are not yet at 2%. And sure, there's some nuance that the 5% is actually 3.5% in one category and 1.5% in a different category. But either way, 5% as an overall goal is much higher than what we thought was going to be the case even just a year ago. There wasn't a topic of conversation back then about 5%. That wasn't even a thought process back then. But here we are now, where 5% seems to be what will be the case. And NATO needs a real plan that is not just a number, but rather a pathway that convincingly gets states to pursue that 5% goal and actually spend the money 5% of GDP on defense. So, given everything that you've talked about so far today with strategic complementarities, what do you think is available and out there that NATO member states could be trying to purchase, which would be politically justifiable to their domestic audiences to increase the defense level of spending that much?
It's certainly no small feat. This is a high bar for any country, and I think part of it is certainly symbolic, trying to see if countries are willing to make that type of level of commitment to NATO. But I think what we also want to see is what countries want to bring to the table. And so, what would be smart for countries within NATO to do would be to demonstrate that they can make a unique contribution to the rest of NATO countries in ways that has additional value added over what those countries are producing themselves. One good example to look at is where we've seen success in the Baltic region, for example. The terrain and territory in the Baltics is very, very challenging to navigate by land. You have a lot of marshes, small lakes, rivers that are difficult to cross, things that make heavy tanks and large land vehicles really challenging to maneuver. So on the one hand, those are things that would be needed in a ground conflict in the region, but not things that those countries should necessarily produce themselves. There's a lot of bridging and ground logistics that those countries in the Baltics have experience producing. They know that land and that territory. They know how to produce the ability for British tanks or for American tanks to be able to traverse the region there. So that's one example of a place where there could be a good complementarity.
And just to be clear here, the fact that Estonia has bridging capacity actually makes it look more attractive for other European countries to build tanks, because given that they have the ability to pass through Estonia to be able to get to the front lines of a potential Russian invasion, having a tank is then more useful, as compared to a situation with Estonia not having the bridging capacity and those tanks being useless. Am I getting this right?
That's exactly right. Every dollar that the British have to spend on bridging capacity for their own vehicles is a dollar that they're not spending on their own tanks. And so they're better off just doing tanks and ensuring that another country in the alliance can make those tanks effective. And this framework completely changes the way that we think about the collective action problem, which traditionally has been built on the assumption that you can't or shouldn't trust others to provide for your defense. But this framework is not only can you trust others to provide for your defense, but your defense dollars can go further by doing so.
Okay, so that has all been focused on high-level military conflict between NATO and Russia in the traditional sense of what you would see in a cinematic war between two major militaries. But the 5% spending target is probably going to cover a lot more things than just that, including smaller-scale conflicts. Do you see the same type of strategic complementarities on that scale as well?
I do. One crisis that NATO faced at the end of the Cold War was NATO's no longer facing a Soviet threat, but that doesn't mean that threats, instabilities, and insecurities went away. There was low-level conflicts in places like Kosovo, there was instability in places like Bosnia, there was the rise of terrorism, drug trafficking, migration challenges. These non-existential forms of security are still things that NATO as an alliance has to face. And so this is a place where we can also see a good division of labor with strategic complementarities in places like the Mediterranean, where having some of the smaller coastal states there, the example of Albania that I gave, have the coastal patrol vessels that can deal with things like terrorism, drug trafficking, other sorts of monitoring, frees up resources for the larger Mediterranean navies to deal with larger threats from state actors.
One of the things that we've been assuming throughout this conversation so far is that when push comes to shove and one member of an alliance is in trouble, that the other members of the alliance are going to help it out. And that seems critical in situations where armies are focused on constructing strategic complementarities. The reason being, imagine that I get myself involved in a war against an opponent, perhaps the other country invaded me. If I have been focusing on building my alliance in a way that is going to maximize overall alliance power, then my portion of the alliance power, my contribution militarily, is going to be functionally worthless. If I'm fighting, for example, a ground war, but I have no air support because I was relying on my partner to have all of the air support. Moreover, if you listen to a lot of the political conversations in Europe right now, there is some tension between Europe and the United States about the US commitment to Europe. And so we might be in a situation where now, where there are these strategic complementarities perhaps being exploited simultaneously, Europeans have to worry that the United States is not going to come to aid Europe in the event of a conflict. So I'm wondering what the strategic complementarities do for the actual decision on whether to intervene or not from a patron state when a protege state gets involved in a war.
I think that strategic complementarity should make partners more reliable because it increases the benefit that they have towards the overall war effort. If your partner is involved in a war and they have 100 tanks and 100 planes, to simplify, you adding some more planes to the war effort doesn't seem like it's going to make as much of a difference. If, by contrast, your partner has 200 tanks and no planes, now there's a sense that your planes can do something to shift the outcome of that conflict. And so the way in which a division of labor increases reliance on an actor or a partner should also increase the degree to which they feel, if I get involved, that can change the outcome of this conflict towards something that is more favorable to me. And we recognize that there's an imbalance that happens within this. The United States is, relatively speaking, a full spectrum military who can do most of the military operations that it wants to by itself as compared to its allies in Europe. But we did see, for example, after the end of the Cold War, European allies had only 4 to 6 of the heavy transport vehicles that are the heavy transport aircraft that are able to move large tanks and Humvees. After what happened in Kosovo, they now developed the ability to produce more of those things and now have approximately 60. And so we see that trust plays a role here in being both something that is a product of having strategic complementarities, but also something that having a strategic complementarity depends on.
Let me recap here to make sure I'm understanding this. What you're saying here is that the decision for a patron state to intervene is going to be a function of how much it can shift the balance of power in its favor by doing that intervention. So if the United States is looking at a war in Europe and thinking to itself, if I intervene because of these strategic complementarities, I'm going to get a very good return on my investment. That makes the United States want to intervene more than a situation where the United States does not have those sorts of strategic complementarities and will only marginally shift the balance of power. If you hold fixed the cost of intervening in both of those cases, then the United States gets a better return with the complementarities.
That's right. I think what we're looking at is this is a way of thinking about a country's bang for the buck. And one thing that strategic complementarities do is massively increase that regarding the decision about whether or not to help out your partner who's in a conflict. One analogy to use to think about this broader way of viewing alliances is as a potluck, where potlucks work because everybody's bringing something different to the table. If you have 5 people who all bring appetizers, funny at first, but you don't have a full meal. What this system shows is the United States, for example, can bring the main course, bring the large turkey, which by itself is great, in addition to a full buffet meal where everybody else is providing everything else. Now it's something that is very great.
And then you have NATO as an organization being the one that organizes the potluck to make sure that one party is bringing the main course, one party is bringing drinks, one party is bringing desserts, a couple of people are bringing the sides, one of them is bringing the appetizer, and so forth.
And there's benefits to being the actor who's making that call. One thing that we see is the countries that have been dominant in NATO, those who have the leadership roles within the organization, like the United States, are able to make those decisions or lead the making of those decisions about who is bringing what. One place that we saw this in NATO was with the standardization agreements that were attempts to standardize the ways that different logistics existed. For example, all NATO vehicles have the same fuel nozzles to make refueling by partner states easier. It doesn't really matter what fuel nozzle they're using, as long as everyone is using the same fuel nozzle, but if it's the one that you already use, that's an added plus. And so that's a place where having a leadership role can make a difference and be a desirable position.
And it seems like there might be a secondary benefit here that you could tell me more about. All alliances face a problem known as entrapment, where a protege state has the possibility of taking actions that the patron state does not particularly like. A war starts as a consequence of the protege's actions, and now suddenly the patron state feels like it's obligated to intervene. Can you talk a little bit more about where strategic complementarities come into play there?
That's certainly a central concern in alliances. You're worried that a partner is going to draw you into a conflict that you wouldn't otherwise. One way that strategic complementarity can address this is by reducing a country's ability to start a war by themselves. If Lithuania doesn't have a sufficient air force and navy to start a war because all they have is a land capability, then they're unlikely to do that by themselves. And this is not just a theoretical concern or mechanism, it's something that we've actually observed. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was notoriously distrusting of a lot of its Warsaw Pact partners, to the point where when the Soviets were giving assistance to Bulgaria for their military, the joke that was made was that Bulgaria's military was not allowed to have anything that moved, because then those things could move westward toward Europe, starting a war that the Soviet Union didn't want to get involved in. So there was a form of specialization that in this case was less cooperative, but that still was a form of specialization by ensuring that Bulgaria only had some military capabilities in a way that constrained potentially warring ambitions rather than fostering them.
So you can get the strategic complementarities to pay out when there is a common value conflict that both the patron and the protege agree upon. But the fact that the patron can withhold the assistance on situations or in situations where the protege is taking an action that the patron has no interest in means that the patron can exert better control over the alliance overall.
Yeah, and this is the economic logic that's known as mutual hostage taking, when two actors don't necessarily trust each other, but they have to have some sort of contract or agreement. You reduce the other actor's incentive to break that contract by making sure that each of you can hold the other hostage in some small way. And so that's a mechanism that can ensure greater cooperation in the military context as well.
Well, for the sake of the West, one hopes that when the heads of state meet at The Hague in the next week and a half or so, that there is a little bit more trust than what we were just talking about there. But this does seem like a great place to wrap things up, so thank you for coming on today.
And thank you so much for having me.
And if you enjoyed today's interview, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Take care.